Welcome to Inspired Change, a new inspirational and motivational broadcast that strives to empower men in a positive way, designed to educate, empower, and inspire even the busiest individual on the go over that first cup of coffee. Please join me in welcoming Gunter, international psychologist, author, speaker, and producer.
Welcome everybody back to another episode of Inspired Change. Now, I've been reflecting for the past week since my conversation with my wife about what would I like to talk about just on my own at the moment. What's important to me in the current context of life and living. Now, interestingly enough, the answer actually virtually jumped out of my work. I see many men on a weekly basis, and a lot of them come in with very distinct psychological disturbances or disorders, but a lot of them, possibly even more than that, come with the idea of struggling with their place in the world and in the time that we've got. So it's an identity issue, or is it? So I want you to think about that for a moment. Because what I want to talk about today is the question of who am I? Now, a lot of people ask themselves this question constantly. And one of the frustrations about it is that we frequently don't actually come up with a really satisfying answer. Unfortunately, too many people never ask that question. They simply operate on a set of assumptions about who they are, take various ideologies as the basis for their existence, but never really reflect on that question about who I am. And I want to help people change that a little bit. Because in my way of viewing self and the world and my relationship with the world is to clearly, from time to time, deliberately and intentionally reflect on those very, very important questions, those existential questions, questions about living, being, doing, and the question of who I am is central to that. Especially for us as men, because for us as men at the moment, the landscape has changed considerably. Even in the last 50 years. I remember hunting through an antique shop, finding a book on how to be the perfect housewife so that you could keep your husband satisfied. And so I was looking at this from the perspective of a male, and I thought, whoa, basically, I'm marrying essentially a housemate who comes with benefits. And it was quite a disturbing insight in many respects, because I knew men at that stage who really truly believed in that, and I bet there's still a lot of guys alive today, and it doesn't matter what age you are, who really sort of wished that that was where we could still be in our relationship with women. So, the question of who am I needs to be really carefully examined, because we often can get stuck in a particular way of looking at ourselves that actually has very little to do with self, but more about the sort of role that I have, the beliefs, the attitudes I have. So just sit for a moment, just reflect. This could be, in fact, one of those moments where you exercise true mindfulness. And I'm going to help you create a structure in which to walk through this. So, if I'm really going to get to the bottom of who I am, how do I need to do this? What is it that I need to do? Well, let me at this stage come back to the issue of the framework that I work with, which is based on fundamental three pillars: self-awareness, flexibility, and resilience. Okay, so in this instance, I want to firstly focus on flexibility. Now, if I'm going to truly examine who I am, I need to be flexible in letting go of my preconceptions, my assumptions, my beliefs, my attitudes. I need to be able to look at them rationally and logically and objectively. Now, in that context, think about it this way. Many of us go into therapy because we actually have a really negative relationship with our self. So, if you're asking yourself, who am I? The chances are that you're very likely going to come up with a very potentially negative answer. It may be even that you come to the conclusion that you are meaningless. It's a nihilistic sort of attitude. Oh, nothing matters and nor do I. Well, is that really how you want to live your life? Is it necessary to think of yourself in that way to live your life? My argument, it isn't. You're cutting yourself and selling yourself short. So, come back to this idea. What is it about self-awareness? Well, self-awareness is going to be physical, okay? So, am I male, female? Am I big, strong, short, tall? Am I overweight? What is it that I am on a physical basis, okay? How do I use my physicality? Does that have some relationship to self? Now, many people would argue that it doesn't. Self is an ethereal, an esoteric notion in this context. Now, we can argue that. I can debate it. I possibly have some sympathy with that idea. But let's really get back into it. So, once I've got myself really in touch with what I think I am physically, and remember the emphasis at this point is on think. I'm not suggesting for one moment that what you think is actually factual, because in my work as a therapist, one of the things that I'm clearly aware of on a daily basis working with people is that often what they think about themselves is completely unrelated to reality. A friend of mine worked long and hard with women with eating disorders, and I've done quite a bit of work in looking at body dysmorphic syndrome with men. And I can tell you from experience that if you ask most of the people that have an eating disorder or a body dysmorphic disorder about what they look like, you get the most unrealistic feedback. They see themselves completely different to what they are factually. Okay, so when I talk about factually, I'm talking about, height, size, weight, BMI. Okay? So this is really important. That is, what we think about ourselves isn't necessarily ourselves. So there is a quote from Ramana Maharishi, which is really interesting, and I remember running into it and pondering it. And he says the question, who am I, is not really meant to get an answer. The question, who am I, is meant to dissolve the questioner. So people often go, well, what does that mean? Well, essentially it's what I'm talking about. And that is that I'm asking in that process of reflection for me to basically suspend whatever ideas, beliefs, attitudes, and so on that I have in examining that question of who I am. So, is who I am in essence my identity? Do I need an identity? Well, most people actually operate on the principle that identity is actually a role. Okay, so, give me your identity card. On it is my name, my date of birth, my address, and a photo. Boom. That's my identity. But is that truly me? What if I was, an undercover agent? Right? So I hand over my identity, but as we can immediately surmise, that's not me. That's just something that was constructed. It's a cute way of playing the game. But if we take that whole idea of identity further and into a deeper place, then I can attach it to the notion that, well, maybe identity is to do with my basic values that dictates my choices. Now again, I'm going to argue that you need to ask yourself that question again. Is that really me, who I am? Or is that what possibly society, my parents, my colleagues expect of me? So yeah, it's going to take a little bit of time and a little bit of work to really get to the bottom of this question. Now, obviously, at some point or another, we're going to hit a wall. Okay? So, generally speaking, the wall happens to do with letting go of my identity. And this is where the trouble comes in for a lot of us as men, because when our social identity changes dramatically, we often struggle with the capacity to deal with that. In other words, identity, the way that we tend to see it in our culture, is static. And so when that's taken away, I encounter an existential crisis, a nothingness of being in a way. And this is toxic. If I truly know some of the principles about self, then that doesn't need to be the case. So one of my first propositions is that self needs to be a changeable experience of something that I hold dear in a way. Because I am not, at my age, the person I was at 12, 15, 25, and you might go, oh, well, that's sort of logical. Is it? I'd like to think it is, but most of us try to behave the way that we did when we were 15, 16. It's interesting when you go to a reunion and, you know, if you haven't seen people for 10 years or 15 years or 20, you know, when we get together in that space, a lot of our behaviour is actually regressive. We start sort of relating to each other the way we did when we were 15. You know, in that place in the playground, in that way at school. And yet when we objectively look at each other, we're very, very different. Not just physically, but emotionally, psychologically, behaviourally, in our attitudes. And that affects, or at least should affect, the way that we relate to each other. So again, the first step is the suspension of judgment, of ideas, of ideologies, of beliefs about attitudes. So that I can truly not just encounter others without judgment, but get in touch with myself. And that self needs to be dynamic. It needs to be able to adapt to the changes of me as I'm getting older. I mean, if I try to take on, you know, a 25-year-old at 75, that's not going to end well, because physically I don't have the capacity necessarily of doing that. There may be some people out there who can do it. I'm never discounting that. But most of us will get a flogging, I can tell you that. So self is not a static concept. It's an idea about me dynamically embracing living. It's an interactional thing. It's not either or. It's not about being. It's not about doing. It's about the both. It's about the two. And so the question comes about is, what's going to give me an anchor in that? And like I said in the conversation with my wife in the last podcast, part of that are our values. It's our capacity to have a certain framework wherein I can be flexible, but also be knowing. And, you know, like in quantum physics, you know, there's an uncertainty principle in that. I don't know how I'm going to react. Unfortunately, some of us are confronted at times with the idea that we're going to die sooner than what we anticipated. Not that any one of us really know when we're going to die, but some do, because they get an illness wherein all the medical knowledge lets us know that there is a very terminal end very soon. And that often creates not just pain, but also an inquisitiveness, a curiosity about, okay, so here it is, got this amount left, what am I going to do with it? Now, in some respects, it might be useful if all of us decided to use some of that in our lives today. You know, what is really important to me? You know, is it power? Is it money? And if that's going to make me happy, really? I suspect it won't. When I was working in aged care, one of the things that I learned very, very quickly that most people didn't, as they were dying, wanted to have more money in the bank. Most people lamented the fact that they didn't have enough intimate relationships. They didn't have enough time with the loved ones in their life. They didn't have the experiences that would make life much, much more fulfilling. So, you know, it's a question of then coming to some decisions about that. It's also about making better choices for yourself. And it's also about staying in touch with your passions, I think. So remember, is not static. We change. We need to adapt. And within that, we have a scope of choices and decisions that are going to make our life better or they're going to make our life worse. The choice is ours and we need to take ownership for that. And we need to really embrace it rather than perhaps just letting it happen to us organically, because sometimes that process will take us into a place that we really didn't want to go. So part of that process is also the capacity to deal with what a lot of men struggle with, and that is that sense of aloneness or isolation or loneliness. When we really allow ourselves to grow, to take this journey without a lot of the judgments that we have, then we don't feel disturbed or distressed when we're in relationship with ourself. Because that can be good company. And on that note, I'm going to call it a day. I want to encourage you to really explore this. And it's going to be on a regular basis. And I'm going to come back to this in future podcasts. So, always remember that you will change, whether you like it or not. Now, isn't it better if you take charge of that change rather than simply being a passenger? Until next time, this is me signing off. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to Inspire Change with Gunter. Gunter Swoboda does individual and group coaching for men looking to grow. For more information on this and the global Making Good Men Great movement, check out goodmengreat.com to get into contact. If you have a topic for the show or would like to be a guest on the air, please email producers at miranda@noirtainment.com. That's Miranda, Miranda, at noirtainment, noirtainment.com. Thank you, and always keep inspiring change.